August 25th, 1944, northern France. The night air trembled with the low growl of engines. A line of headlights snaked across the horizon, cutting through dust and exhaustion. The war had turned a corner. Paris had just been liberated. But victory was hungry. The Allied armies were racing east, deeper into a broken continent, and every bullet, every ration, every drop of fuel depended on what rumbled down these roads. Through the fog and diesel haze, hundreds of trucks rolled, tires grinding over mud and shattered stone, their drivers half awake, their faces streaked with oil and sweat. Somewhere in that endless convoy was a machine that history almost forgot, a truck once dismissed as useless, now carrying the lifeblood of an army. In the cab of one such truck, Private James Red Mitchell fought to stay awake. The wheel vibrated under his hands as he shifted gears, his eyes flicking between the dim taillights ahead. Around him, the convoy moved like a living thing. Hundreds of men, mostly young, mostly black, bound by duty and desperation. They were the Red Ball Express, the invisible artery that fed General Patton's Third Army as it charged toward Germany. The road was dangerous, the hours endless, but the trucks never stopped. As the convoy rolled past ruined villages, the camera would pan upward, smoke drifting over the French countryside, the distant thunder of artillery echoing to the east. Over this imagery, the narrator's voice cuts through. In war, glory belongs to those at the front, but victory depends on those who keep the front alive. The rhythm of engines becomes a heartbeat, steady and relentless. This was not the sound of battle. It was the sound of endurance. Yet few knew that behind this lifeline was a man, an uncelebrated mechanic from Detroit, whose idea had once been laughed out of the factory floor. A design too heavy, too crude, too slow, they said. But war has a strange way of redefining worth. When the Allies needed something that could survive Europe's wrecked roads and endless miles, that worthless machine became the one thing that could not be replaced. And so begins our story, not in the halls of command, but in the grease-stained workshops where dreams were welded from steel. This is the untold tale of the truck that saved an army, the men who drove it, and the mechanic who built it. Sound fades, engines hum, night wind passes through open windows, a convoy stretches into the distance. Then silence. Title appears, How One Mechanic's Worthless Truck Design Became the Red Ball Express's Lifeline. Spring 1944. The world was turning beneath the weight of invasion plans. Across the English Channel, Allied commanders prepared for Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious assault in human history. Millions of tons of supplies, food, fuel, ammunition, spare parts, were stacked in British depot, waiting to cross the sea. The plan was simple on paper: land in Normandy, push inland, and drive the Germans out of France. But paper did not bleed, and it did not break under the strain of mud and war. The truth was harsher. Armies move on fuel, and without fuel, even victory grinds to a halt. Logistics was the hidden war, and it was about to decide the fate of Europe. At the heart of this invisible struggle stood the U.S. Army's Transportation Corps, a branch rarely seen in photographs, rarely mentioned in dispatches. They didn't wear medals into battle. They wore grease on their hands and exhaustion in their eyes. By August 1944, as Allied divisions broke through Normandy and swept across France, supply lines began to stretch thin. What was once a 40-mile trip from the beaches became hundreds. Railroads were shattered, bridges bombed, and French ports were still under enemy control. Every gallon of fuel had to be trucked over ruined roads. What they needed was not glamour. They needed grit, wheels that could take punishment and keep rolling. And it was here that the forgotten truck found its purpose. It was the GMC CCKW2 1 to 2 ton truck, known simply as the Deuce and a Half, designed before the war by a team led by a modest mechanic and engineer named William Knudsen. It was a rugged, utilitarian machine. At first, Army officials dismissed it, too heavy for field use, too basic for combat zone. But as the war deepened, the Deuce and a Half became the workhorse of the Allies. By 1944, nearly 800,000 of them rolled off American assembly lines, a river of steel flowing toward the front. Knudsen, once an automobile mechanic in Detroit, had risen through sheer ingenuity. He understood not just engines, but endurance. That war machines didn't need elegance, they needed reliability. His design could carry men, fuel, and ammunition through hell itself. When others called it worthless, he called it unstoppable. That belief, buried beneath paperwork and military skepticism, would soon fuel an entire army across a continent. Meanwhile, General Dwight D. Eisenhower faced a different kind of crisis. His troops had broken the German lines in Normandy faster than expected. The Allies were advancing so rapidly that supply chains couldn't keep up. Patton's tanks were thirsty, Montgomery's men were hungry, and every advance risked stalling. Eisenhower described it as a victory strangled by success. The front demanded fuel, but the ports and depots lay far behind. The question was no longer how to win battles. It was how to keep moving. That question gave birth to the Red Ball Express, a lifeline of over 6,000 trucks manned by more than 23,000 drivers, most of them African-American soldiers serving in segregated units. They were assigned a single mission: drive day and night from Normandy to the front, hauling fuel and ammunition non-stop. There were no rest breaks, no safety guarantees, and often no lights, only discipline, courage, and diesel. The roads they drove were so critical that signs marked them Red Ball Route, authorized vehicles only. Those routes became arteries of survival. Behind the roar of engines and the bravery of drivers was the truck that made it all possible: Knudsen's so-called failure. The Deuce and a Half carried 10 times its rated load, crawled through swamps, and conquered hillsides that tanks avoided. It became the iron backbone of an advancing army. Soldiers often said, if it couldn't be done by the Red Ball, it couldn't be done at all. That was no exaggeration. As the Red Ball Express roared to life in late August 1944, few stopped to think about the origins of their trucks or the man behind their creation. But in every turn of the wheel, in every gallon delivered, Knudsen's idea lived, a testament to the quiet genius of a mechanic who built something unbreakable in a world falling apart. Sound cue: distant engines fade into archival factory noise, welding sparks, metal presses, voices calling out over machinery. The war's front lines shift from Europe to Detroit, where the fight was waged not with rifles, but with wrenches. Late August 1944, the dawn light broke over Normandy's battered countryside, revealing endless convoys assembling along narrow French roads. Dust clung to the air as drivers climbed into their trucks, fastening helmets, tightening gloves, and whispering quick prayers before starting their engines. The Red Ball Express was about to begin its first full-scale operation, a 700-mile supply route stretching from the beaches near Saint-Lô to the advancing spearheads near Chartres, Reims, and Verdun. The roads were primitive, choked with rubble and craters, yet the mission was clear: keep Patton's Third Army fueled, or watch the offensive die. Commanders had calculated the need: 350,000 gallons of fuel every day, delivered under constant risk. There was no glamour here, only grit and gasoline. In makeshift motor pools, soldiers checked their trucks, tightening bolts, patching tires, and repainting unit numbers in the early morning light. The GMC CCKW trucks, their olive-drab paint dulled by dust, lined up like patient beasts of burden. Each could carry 2.5 tons, but drivers often doubled or tripled the load, strapping fuel drums and crates until the suspension groaned. The men knew the risks. The Germans were retreating but not gone. Snipers, mines, and strafing aircraft haunted the routes. Yet, what they feared most was fatigue. Drivers would go 2, sometimes 3 days without rest, their only companions being the rhythmic hum of the engine and the endless road. A radio operator once said, "You could smell the diesel in your dreams." Back at headquarters in Cherbourg, Colonel Lauren Ayres watched maps covered in red lines, the lifeblood of the campaign. Each line represented hundreds of trucks, each dot a fuel depot or rest point. He knew logistics would determine victory. "Our tanks can win the war," he once told his staff, "but only if our trucks don't quit first." The Red Ball route was given top priority. Signs were posted, warning that no civilian or unauthorized military vehicles could enter. Military police enforced speed limits, cleared wrecks, and kept the convoy moving around the clock. The motto became simple: keep 'em rolling. And at the center of this massive machine, Knudsen's trucks became the unsung hero, designed for the factory, reborn for the battlefield. August 23rd, 1944, northern France. The fields of Normandy still smoldered from battle, the air thick with dust and smoke as the first light of dawn spread across the battered countryside. On the cracked roads near Saint-Lô, the sound of engines broke the silence. Hundreds of trucks idling in the morning chill. Soldiers moved like shadows, tightening straps, checking tires, and loading crates of fuel, ammunition, and rations. Some wore fresh uniforms. Others still carried the grime of weeks spent under shell fire. The war was moving east, and so were they. It was here, in the ruins of France, that a new kind of battle would begin, not fought with rifles, but with endurance, precision, and wheel. The Red Ball Express was assembling, and its heartbeat was the steady growl of the GMC CCKW, the so-called worthless truck that had become the one thing standing between victory and stagnation. The roads ahead were chaos, cratered, muddy and broken by retreating German forces who had destroyed bridges and railways in their wake. Yet the Allied advance could not pause. General Patton's tanks were tearing through France faster than anyone predicted, consuming fuel at a staggering rate. His armored divisions, once roaring triumphantly, now faced a grim truth. Every mile forward risked running dry. Eisenhower's high command knew that no supply line, no matter how daring, could match the speed of the advance, unless they created something extraordinary. Thus, on August 25th, 1944, the Red Ball Express officially roared to life. Its mission: move over 12,000 tons of supplies every day, from the beaches of Normandy to the front lines near Chartres, Verdun, and Reims. For the men behind the wheels, it was not a job. It was survival on repeat. In dusty motor pools near Cherbourg and Isigny, drivers gathered around their vehicles for final checks. The trucks looked crude, long, heavy, and unsophisticated, but under their hoods lay the difference between progress and paralysis. Knudsen's design had been built for punishment. The engine, a six-cylinder GMC 270, could run through mud, snow, and gravel for hundreds of miles without failure. The suspension was built to endure weight beyond its rated limit. Each truck could carry 5,000 pounds, though soldiers often doubled that, stacking jerry cans, shells, and ration crates until the truck groaned. When asked if it could handle the load, one driver reportedly laughed and said, "If it breaks, we'll weld it back together before sunrise." That was the spirit of the Express. Nothing stopped moving. Before every run, convoys assembled like a rolling army of ghosts. Trucks lined up bumper to bumper, engines humming in unison, exhaust smoke rising in thin white streams. At dawn, the signal was given. A single green flare arced into the sky, and the convoys lurched forward. The roads were narrow, barely wide enough for two vehicles to pass, and speed was life. Every convoy operated on a strict schedule: drive fast, don't stop, don't turn off your lights. The Red Ball route was one way, loaded trucks going east, empty ones returning west, both running 24 hours a day. Drivers slept in their cabs, ate cold rations on the move, and learned to keep their eyes open even when their bodies screamed for rest. For them, the rumble of the engine was the only lullaby. Most of the men behind those wheels were young African-American, soldiers from the segregated quartermaster units, men who had enlisted to serve their country, but were often denied combat roles. The Red Ball Express became their war, their chance to prove worth beyond prejudice. They faced not just the enemy's remnants, but also the silence of recognition. In rain, fog, and moonlight, they drove, through sniper fire, through wreckage, through exhaustion that blurred the line between courage and survival. One veteran later recalled, "You'd drive until the road looked like a river, and you couldn't tell if the sound in your head was the engine or your heartbeat." They called themselves the Iron Men, and with every mile, they earned that name. The logistics officers at headquarters calculated every movement. The convoy system was designed with military precision. Trucks were grouped into serial, each led by a command jeep, spaced exactly 5 minutes apart. The routes were marked by red circles painted on signs, a symbol that gave the operation its name. Military police manned intersections, clearing the way for the endless flow of trucks. No civilian vehicle was allowed within the route. It was sacred ground for the lifeline of the Allied armies. Still, chaos was constant. Blowouts were common. Engines overheated, bridges collapsed, and rain turned dirt roads into swamps. When trucks got stuck, drivers pushed them out with bare hands. When fuel spilled, they scooped it with helmets. There was no time for delay. Patton's tanks were waiting. The radio chatter along the route was a language of its own, clipped, urgent, and raw. Convoy 7 moving through Argentan. Road clear. Fuel truck down near Mortain. Need tow. Keep rolling. Repeat. Keep rolling. That last line became a mantra, whispered by every driver. They carried fuel barrels labeled precious cargo because each drop meant another shell fired, another mile gained, another soldier fed. The drivers joked darkly that they were hauling victory by the gallon, but behind the humor lay fear. One mistake, one doze behind the wheel, and the truck could flip into a ditch or explode under fire. Still, they drove on. The Red Ball Express didn't have heroes in headlines. It had thousands of silent ones behind steering wheel. Meanwhile, far from the front, Knudsen watched reports from Europe reach the War Production Board. He had once been told his truck design was outdated, too heavy for modern warfare. Now, generals were calling it the most important piece of equipment in Europe. For him, it wasn't pride that mattered. It was vindication. He had believed in simplicity, in machinery built for endurance, not elegance. The GMC CCKW's engine block, transmission, and drive axle were designed for ease of repair, allowing soldiers to fix them in the field with little more than a wrench and grit. That practicality was saving lives every hour. In the endless grind of the Red Ball Express, his worthless truck had become the backbone of victory. Back in France, the drivers grew into legends among the troops. When infantrymen saw the convoys arrive, bringing hot rations and gasoline under the cover of night, they cheered. One officer described it in his diary. They came out of the darkness, headlights covered, moving like a chain of ghosts. You could hear them long before you saw them, and when they left, the road went quiet, as if the war itself paused to breathe. These moments of awe stitched themselves into the memory of the campaign. The Red Ball Express wasn't just a supply line. It was a moving symbol of willpower, proof that speed, strength, and sacrifice could coexist on four wheels. By mid-September 1944, the convoys were moving nearly 6,000 trucks per day, each averaging 500 miles per run. The men slept when they could, sometimes in ditches, sometimes sitting upright in their cabs. The road blurred into one endless path, lit only by the glow of cigarettes and the faint glimmer of covered headlights. Rain-soaked uniforms, mud-caked boots, and exhaustion-hollowed faces, yet morale endured. Each driver knew that a tank stalled for lack of fuel could mean a soldier's death, and that thought kept them awake when everything else failed. In their rumbling engines, they carried the pulse of the entire Western Front. And as the Red Ball Express reached full stride, a transformation occurred, not just of machinery, but of men. Mechanics who had once worked in silence now commanded convoys. Drivers who had never been saluted found respect on every front. The convoy routes became arteries of unity, linking every soldier, every effort, every heartbeat of the Allied push. It was no longer about one mechanic's rejected design, nor even about the trucks themselves. It was about what they represented: resilience, adaptation, faith in the simple strength of men and machines built for endurance. Sound cue. The roar of hundreds of engines swells, merging with the distant thud of artillery. Camera pans over an endless column of trucks stretching across the French plains. Narrator's voice fades in. They were not soldiers seeking glory. They were drivers chasing survival. And through them, an army moved, and history followed. September 2nd, 1944, somewhere near Chartres, France. The sun had barely risen, yet the roads already thundered with motion. Hundreds of trucks rolled eastward, their olive-drab bodies vibrating with the weight of war. Dust spiraled from their tires, catching in the early light like smoke from invisible fires. Every truck bore the red circle insignia, the mark of the Red Ball Express, stamped on hoods and windshields, a sign that this convoy answered only to one command: keep moving. The drivers had no music, no comfort, and no promise of rest. Their soundtrack was the hum of the engine, the rattle of fuel drums, and the whisper of wind through broken French villages. This was the lifeline of the Allied advance, a river of steel flowing through a continent torn apart. Each day began the same way: a distant whistle, a shouted order, and a rumble of ignition as engines came alive one by one. Convoy leaders checked maps pinned under dashboard lights, marking roads that were sometimes little more than tracks through mud. Bridges were temporary, built overnight by engineers who worked under artillery shadows. The Red Ball drivers trusted nothing but instinct and the faint glow of convoy markers on the horizon. They drove without headlights, guided by memory, fear, and the rhythm of the man ahead. Fatigue blurred vision, and more than once, trucks vanished into ditches, swallowed by darkness and exhaustion. Yet there was no stopping. The line had to remain unbroken. The army depended on it. Fuel was their burden and their blessing. Each truck carried up to 700 gallons of gasoline, volatile, precious, and deadly. One stray spark, one tracer round, and the convoy could become a rolling inferno. The drivers knew it. They could feel the heat of the barrels behind them and smell the sharp tang of fuel that seeped through the canvas covers. German aircraft still prowled the skies, and though their numbers were dwindling, the danger remained. Strafing runs came without warning. A distant whine of engines, a flash of light, and then chaos. Trucks scattered off the road, diving into ditches or under trees, their drivers gripping the wheel with white-knuckled hands. Some made it back onto the road. Others never did. The next morning, their burned-out trucks became silent mile markers of sacrifice. One such driver, Corporal Raymond Harris, once described the experience in his diary. The road never ends. The trucks ahead disappear into dust. The ones behind fade into night. You don't think, you don't feel, you just drive. Because if you stop, someone dies without fuel. And if you make it, you start again. His words echoed the truth of the Red Ball Express, that heroism was not in the battle cry, but in the quiet persistence of men who refused to stop. For many, these trucks were more than machines. They were companions, extensions of their will. Soldiers gave them names: Old Betsy, Rosie, Widowmaker, and treated them like brothers in arms. The GMC CKSEQU, once dismissed as a failure, now proved its worth on every mile. Its suspension held under impossible weight. Its engine roared even when punctured by shrapnel. When mud swallowed wheels, the trucks dug themselves out with sheer torque. Mechanics carried toolkits like surgeons, performing field repairs under artillery fire. A broken axle could mean hours lost, hours the front could not afford. And yet they fixed them, sometimes welding by moonlight, sometimes using spare parts scavenged from wrecks. Every working truck was a victory. Every mile conquered an act of defiance against the impossible. The convoy routes twisted through bombed-out villages and empty fields. French civilians stood at doorways, watching in silence as the endless line of trucks passed. Some waved small flags, others offered bread or water to the drivers who stopped briefly for repairs. To the locals, these men were symbols of liberation, soldiers without rifles who brought the breath of victory with them. To the drivers, it was just another mile, another bridge, another dawn blurred by exhaustion. Yet somewhere deep inside, they knew they were part of something greater than themselves. An army within an army, the beating heart of progress. As the weeks went on, the wear took its toll. Drivers fell asleep mid-route, their trucks swerving dangerously before regaining balance. Others drove with their boots off, trying to stay awake as the vibration numbed their feet. Accidents were frequent. Collisions, overturned loads, and burned engines became part of the landscape. Military police patrolled constantly, clearing wrecks to keep the roads open. If one truck stops, an officer once said, the whole artery clots. It was no exaggeration. A single breakdown could block miles of vehicle. But the men learned to adapt. They worked in silence, disciplined by exhaustion, bonded by necessity. By mid-September, the Red Ball Express was operating at full capacity. More than 6,000 trucks moving daily, delivering over 2,500 tons of supply. The pace was brutal, but effective. Patton's tanks, which had nearly run dry, were now pushing deeper into Lorraine. Eisenhower's staff called the operation a miracle of logistics. The drivers called it survival. Each day, the front lines moved further east, and the convoys stretched longer, their journey growing with the war. They had become the spine of the Allied advance, invisible to the headlines, yet indispensable to victory. At night, the world turned black. The convoys drove under total darkness, their headlights covered with slits to prevent enemy spotting. The only light came from the dull glow of cigarette tips and the faint outline of trucks silhouetted by the moon. Rain turned the roads into swamps, and engines drowned in mud. When trucks stalled, others stopped to tow them, chaining bumpers and dragging each other through the mire. It wasn't just machinery that kept the line alive. It was camaraderie. The men helped one another because no one else would. They were alone on the road, and only the road understood them. In one of the most dangerous stretches near Verdun, German artillery still lingered. Convoys moved cautiously through cratered terrain, their paths marked by the wrecks of those who came before. When shells fell nearby, drivers ducked instinctively but never stopped. There was no time for fear, no space for hesitation. The trucks pressed forward, engines roaring through smoke and debris. To see it was to witness a force of nature, relentless, mechanical, alive. The Deuce and a Half was not just a truck anymore. It was a soldier of steel, carrying the spirit of thousands who refused to let the war stand still. By October, the Red Ball Express had transported more than 400,000 tons of supplies. It kept Patton's armored columns moving, ensured food reached the infantry, and fueled every tank, jeep, and aircraft across northern France. Without it, the Allied advance might have faltered before the German border. General Eisenhower would later call it the lifeline of victory. Yet few of the men who drove those trucks ever saw medals or parades. When the operation wound down in November, many simply returned to other duties, mechanics, loaders, and drivers once more, their service fading quietly into history. But the legacy of those days lingered, in grease-stained hands, in worn tires, and in the endless echo of engines on forgotten roads. The Red Ball Express had proven something the war often forgot, that courage wears many faces. It can carry a rifle or a wrench, march or drive, command or obey. And sometimes it comes from a man whose idea was once laughed out of a meeting room, a mechanic who believed that strength was built not in glory, but in reliability. William Knudsen's truck had become immortal through the sweat of the men who drove it. As the last convoys rolled toward the German border, autumn winds swept across the French countryside. The Red Ball routes, once roaring with motion, fell silent. Only the tire tracks remained, fading into the mud and memory of victory. The war would continue. The Battle of the Bulge loomed ahead, but the backbone of Allied logistics had already proven its power. The Deuce and a Half would serve until the end of the war, in every theater, from the frozen forests of Ardennes to the ruins of Berlin. Sound cue. Engines fading slowly into silence, replaced by wind and distant thunder. The narrator's voice returns, soft and reflective. They called it the Red Ball Express, but it was more than a convoy. It was determination on wheels, courage in motion, and proof that even in war, the simplest machine can carry the weight of a world. Camera pans over a desolate French road at sunset. Burned trucks rest quietly in the distance, their mission complete. And in the hum of an idle engine, history took a breath and moved forward. November 1944, France. The roar of engines that once shook the countryside was fading now. The Red Ball Express had slowed, its convoys thinning as new supply lines, railroads, and captured ports came back to life. The once endless columns of trucks were now scattered across Europe, some reassigned, some broken down, many simply abandoned along roads they had conquered with persistence. The drivers, too, were scattered. Some were reassigned to other duties. Others moved toward new campaigns in Belgium and the Ardennes. The Red Ball Express had lasted just 81 days, but its impact could not be measured in time alone. It had carried not just fuel and ammunition, but the momentum of liberation itself. The statistics told only part of the story. 412,000 tons of supplies, moved over thousands of miles through broken terrain under constant threat and exhaustion. But behind every number was a face, a young mechanic who learned to fix an axle under fire, A driver who stayed awake for 3 straight days, clutching a wheel slick with sweat. A man who laughed in the face of danger because there was no other choice. Many of them would never appear in photographs or history books. Their names were recorded only in dusty ledgers, listed under transportation corps. Yet without them, no general could have advanced, no tank could have rolled, no victory could have come when it did. They were, in truth, the invisible soldiers of the war. For General Eisenhower, the lesson was clear. He later called logistics the most vital and least glamorous part of war. He credited the Red Ball Express as one of the decisive factors in maintaining the Allied advance through France. Patton himself, always a man of bold words, admitted, "My tanks could not have gone a mile without those boys on the road. Their work had given strategy its heartbeat." But for the drivers themselves, the praise came quietly, if at all. They returned to camps weary and uncelebrated, many still living under the segregation that defined their service. They had carried the lifeblood of victory, yet returned to a world still divided by color and class. The trucks they drove, the GMC CCKWs, became icons of endurance. Soldiers began calling them Knudsen's Iron Mules, a name whispered with affection and respect. Wherever they went, the deuce and a half proved its worth. In the mud of the Ardennes, the snow of Alsace, the mountains of Italy, they were stripped, modified, rebuilt, and reused until the very end of the war. Their design became the blueprint for post-war military transport. And somewhere in Detroit, William H. Knudsen, the mechanic once dismissed by his peers, read reports of his trucks crossing Europe, carrying victory on their backs. He never sought fame, but he understood something deeper. In war, the simplest design often carries the greatest weight. As the war pressed on, the lessons of the Red Ball Express reshaped how armies thought about supply. Commanders realized that logistics was not an afterthought, it was the essence of warfare. The convoy system, the one-way routes, the discipline of constant motion, all became model for future military operations. Even decades later, in Korea, Vietnam, and the Middle East, the echoes of the Red Ball could be heard in the convoys that followed. The methods forged on the roads of France had become doctrine, a legacy written not in ink, but in tire tracks and perseverance. But there was another, quieter legacy, one of human dignity. For the thousands of African-American soldiers who served in the Red Ball Express, the operation was more than a mission. It was proof that courage knew no color, that discipline and excellence could shine even in the shadow of prejudice. Many of them returned home to a divided America, their heroism unacknowledged, their sacrifices buried under the noise of victory. Yet history would catch up. Decades later, their role would be honored. Documentaries, monuments, and oral histories restoring their rightful place in the narrative of World War II. The Red Ball Express became not just a story of logistics, but of justice delayed and dignity reclaimed. In the aftermath of the campaign, as winter crept over Europe, the once busy roads grew silent again. The signs marked Red Ball Route, authorized vehicles only, were taken down. The fields that once trembled under convoys returned to quiet, yet the scars of their passage remain. Ruts in the mud, broken bridges, rusted fuel drums half buried in soil. To the men who had driven those roads, the silence felt unnatural. They had lived for motion, for the hum of engines and the call of duty that began every dawn. Now, in the stillness, they understood what they had achieved. Not just a logistical feat, but a miracle of will. The legacy of the Red Ball Express lived on through every supply chain that followed. Every soldier who understood that wars are not only won by those who fight, but by those who make fighting possible. It was a triumph of engineering, endurance, and humanity. And though it ended quietly, its echo reached far beyond the war. The roads they paved, the bridges they built, the unity they forged, all became part of a story larger than themselves. The story of how one mechanic's so-called worthless idea became the backbone of an army, and how ordinary men turned machinery into meaning. Sound cue, a soft rumble fades in, engines starting one last time, blending with the wind. The narrator's voice returns, low and solemn. They didn't fight for medals. They didn't fight for glory. They fought to keep the wheels turning. And in doing so, they moved history itself. The screen fades to black. Archival photos of the Red Ball Express appear. Long convoys stretching through the dust, faces lit by the glow of diesel lamps. History rarely remembers the tired men who made victory possible. The voice continues. But every road they paved, every load they carried, every mile they conquered, carried the weight of a world that would soon be free. The war has long ended. The convoys have vanished. But if you stand quietly on those same roads today, you can still feel it. The heartbeat of the Red Ball Express. The faint memory of tires on gravel. The low hum of diesel cutting through the dawn. These were not the roads of generals or politicians. They were the roads of ordinary men who carried extraordinary burdens. Men who drove without headlights through blackened nights, who followed tire tracks instead of stars, who believed that every mile forward meant 1 mile closer to home. History often celebrates the victories won in battle, the heroism of those who charged, who fired, who conquered. But seldom does it pause for the ones who delivered the means to make victory possible. The Red Ball Express was their monument, a moving lifeline that never stood still long enough to be carved in stone. They didn't command divisions or wear decorations. Their weapon was reliability, their courage, persistence. They won their war not with bullets, but with motion. Sound cue, a faint rumble builds, the distant growl of a convoy awakening. The roads that once trembled under their wheels now lie silent, reclaimed by time and nature. But every rut, every scar on the landscape tells a story of men who worked through exhaustion, who fixed engines with frozen fingers, who laughed in the face of monotony because the alternative was despair. Theirs was not the glory of battle, it was the quiet valor of endurance. And in many ways, that kind of courage lasts the longest. For William Knudsen, the mechanic, the dreamer, the legacy of his so-called worthless truck became something far greater than machinery. His design moved armies, liberated nations, and redefined what it meant to serve. He had built more than steel. He had built momentum, the kind that cannot be stopped, only remembered. His trucks outlived the war, carrying supplies for years to come, serving as a symbol of how even the smallest act of creation can echo across history. Visual cue. Archival footage fades in. Convoys in motion. Smiling soldiers waving from cabs. A dusty sign that reads, Red Ball Route. The voice returns, calm and steady. The Red Ball Express was not a tale of glory. It was a story of grit, of engines that refused to die, of men who refused to quit, and of one idea, that no load was too heavy if the mission was just. The sound fades, replaced by silence. The camera pans across an empty French highway, the same route where thousands once drove. A single truck horn echoes in the distance, fading into the horizon. In the end, the narrator says softly, history is not written by those who arrive first, but by those who keep the world moving. This is W2 Revisited, where history lives again.